Welcome to Mindful Drawing. I'm Robert, and I'll be your guide on this meditation practice that enters a space of mindfulness through the act of drawing. This week we'll take a little lighter mood. My partner is celebrating their birthday at this time of year, and so I spent some time making a cake for that. And during that process, like any other act you undertake, you can bring some mindfulness and pace to it, explore the textures, smells, interaction with the sensations of that thing, and maybe recall or harken back to some ideas of still life, of capturing the essence of something through the creative act, painting or drawing. And we'll harness a little bit of that today, thinking through how we mindfully engage with a subject on the page, how an object can form visually from a few lines of framing that make it look three-dimensional with planes interacting in space, and emerge as something we recognize, something we can feel, sense, smell, taste, and then bring that full sensory perception of our imagination out through the interface of the pencil on the page. We'll be drawing a little piece of cake, mindfully interacting with the layers, with the materials, with the setting, and bringing some texture and contrast to it, seeing how far we'll get through the exercise. It'll be somewhere along its way to forming as that expression of cake, an experience of something we all probably share and can relate to in celebration, as a treat, something enticing and exciting. And maybe if you've made one, some of that interaction comes back into your mind and you have to fill out a full space of imagination around the subject matter. I'll stick primarily with pencil, as it allows for that kind of lightness of layering in detail, getting expression through feeling out a line, letting edges become slightly more soft and organic, something more real to the idea of cake. But anything should work. Pencil, pen, colored pencil, marker, whatever you can form some lines with, we'll get you there along the way, so feel free to explore in that expression today. As we prepare, take a couple of moments, take a good breath in, let come to mind your favorite type of cake, style of cake, flavor. Maybe smell it a little bit so the image coalesces. And then go ahead and gather your supplies, establish your space, and let's draw together. I was making a cake for my partner's birthday this week, and thought that might be some place to start with inspiration. Not necessarily the cake I made, but we've all seen a cake. We all have a sense of what a cake looks like, and we can find layers of detail in that construction, and will be a big part of it. So in warming up or getting familiar with it, we just think through several ways you imagine cake, and in the drawing kind of find your way in. Start simple just by thinking of kind of that slice or wedge, and if you were to see that front corner of something cut out of a cake, a line that goes back at an angle, keep them kind of parallel to make a little parallelogram in two directions, would start to form those two sides of a slice. It's a round cake. I'm going to get roughly part of a big ellipse or circle back there. Small part, doesn't have to be exact, but helps us find the verticals around the sides. So that might be one way that we are used to seeing and envisioning cakeness. Maybe the other is the whole thing, which comes from a bit of an ellipse. I'm going to use pencil today to allow for some feeling out of the lines. If we draw curves or want to layer some things, get it in place. So the whole exists. Again, the sides kind of come down straight if we want a little bit of a 3D view, and then a mirrored-ish relationship there, depending on how much confection may be used. It may have a more crisp shape or a softer shape. Again, that's something that you can develop on your drawing newer version. Something like that could even have a slice cut out of it, working along the surface, working around the edges, and slowly carving the way in. Some of this could be erased or come in later. So in this warm-up, testing out a few things of where you want to start. Both can come into play with the individual piece. Maybe it sits compositionally on a nice part of a plate, and that becomes one of the layers to the drawing that we can look at. Maybe other things accompany it. There's also the top, the frosting, the layers, and other things we can get into. It's a larger piece. Maybe it's on a stand. Maybe you see it purely from above. We have a circle, and you write something on it. Maybe there can be little candle moments, other things that come to mind in terms of cake for you, but we'll build it up a little bit at a time from whatever starting form you're interested in. I think I'll begin just with the layers of the wedge. And so whichever it is, whether it's the full round or just a part, we'll give it a light etching in with pencil, or light framing in with pen if you'd like. Pencil maybe a little easier to interact with the layers. The pen could come in later if you want to add a little more emphasis or robustness to things. I think the first thing is choosing where it kind of sits on the page, feeling out large and centered, a little smaller, in the medium zone, centered there. Finding just a light vertical line as that edge of a slice, perhaps. Again, whether that's a slice cut in or slice cut out, you can always take on your journey. I think I'll do a slice cut out, give it a bit of size to it. And then we have angles. The more close the angle is to the horizontal, the more we're seeing from the side, taking a moment to think about how we're engaging the page, what kind of comes to mind. The more intense or vertical the angle becomes, the more we're kind of looking at it obliquely, and somewhere kind of in the middle, a little above 45, but not too much. We'll let us see perhaps a little of both sides. Not knowing exactly how big it will be, just letting the line head off some angle between 0 and 90 in one direction. And then we can choose if we want a larger piece of cake using a reciprocal angle, or a smaller piece, a much more vertical, large piece, much more horizontal on the other side. And letting that line head out. So this is a pretty big wedge, just based on those angles. Once they're in place, we have a sense of height, the directionality for seeing the form on the page, and based on the edges of the paper, a little space somewhere at the top, at the bottom, at the sides, we can find a place for that back defining curve of the round form. So we might do parallel lines out the top and bottom, making that chevron shape, the wedge, start to appear a little bit as two sides in 3D. And somewhere out there in space, not too close to the edge, and maybe not too close to the tip, we find a little part of a circle or ellipse. Since it's only a small portion here, its exact bend isn't as important as just feeling like it moves pretty evenly between the two. And that gives us our top general wedge. From those 2 points of intersection with the curve and the two lines, and bring a line straight down, I suppose in any shape you like, but as a framing in. just a bit straight down. And now we've got that form emerging on the page, and we can use that form as an anchor for the eyes and the imagination, an anchor for the mind. Working in some of the details, we know of this object, some layer on the outside of frosting or confection, a few layers perhaps on the inside, depending on what you like or comes to mind. The density there, begin to play with their texture and kind of visual contrast and relationship. I think I'll work very lightly around the top. Moderate but generous thickness to forming kind of a layer of frosting. Always a little wobbly, whenever it's quite perfect as it meets that softer layer on the interior. It gives us a bit of an L-shaped framing on the side to something in there. And we can repeat that around two directions, feeling out some of the edges, the place where the knife cuts pretty crisp, the place where the icing is formed, maybe a little rounder, the inside wrapping of the soft middle, a little bit of breaking to the edge. Generally consistent feeling in its thickness. Warming out that shell around a space. A nice M here on the page. And with that roughly in place, into the bottom edge, knowing it's the softer portion, perhaps, depending on what cake comes to mind. You give mine just a little roughing at the edge here, a little rounding. Never cut quite exact, but fairly sharp. Just as a differentiation to call that out to the foreground and let some of the construction slide to the background. And this front line, I'll let develop over time, something that will interact with the materials that come together. With a couple of breaths, we pull into the mind the number of layers you'd like to engage with. Any number is fine. Very lightly on that top edge, begin to mark them out. One little tick for the bottom, a little tick for the top of the interface between the spacing, a similar little mark, dividing that line into somewhat even oscillations between thick and thin, or all the same, depending on how you like your cake. And then we can begin drawing one or the other, whichever comes to you first, the softer cake layer or the more firm, malleable icing layer, bringing up that bottom corner, extending back parallel to that right or left edge, wrapping in to the shell a little bit, calling it out as its own distinct shape of material. I'm going to bring my focus to always drawing the kind of cakey part and letting the icing part in between form. So the cake always a little variable, depending on how it's cut, what it's made of, forming out those layers, parallelograms in this construction from the corner. And as we draw those, we can slow down a little using a pencil, taking the time around them to feel how it moves along the paper, the kind of silkiness of graphite, allowing for smooth, flexible adjustments in the line. Not needing to go too heavy, can be very light to feel out of direction, and repeat over the top to solidify, adding a little more visual variation, an organic difference. We have several of these around the object, so we can take our time with them, bring the attention in it to our way of drawing. We might all have a different interaction, perhaps a quick, clean, crisp line, very sharp and straight, or a sketchy, searching line working its way across the page. Not worried about good or bad technique. Noticing how we start to engage with forming something we see a bit in our head, something we have some memories of through that interface of the pencil, wherever it's at. And working on both directions, so you can see both. Taking time to retrace and lightly thicken or feather edges, recognizing that material interface between zones, not virtual and perfectly precise, always a little wobbly, a little variable, some kind of shadow as materials meet the eye. Breathing evenly into the act of drawing, noticing the light rise and fall, the shoulders of the rib cage, the line extension of that rhythm and temperament, occasionally brought forward, the inhalation, feeling the breath move through the body, receding on the exhalation, returning again in cycles. At times, attention forward, the way the breath changes our position a little bit, changes our speed and action with the page. And then we can change our breath to meet the action we see or feel, want to engage with, all coming together in one system. An endless layering and relayering of tempos. As those elements form, if you still have some layers to work with, continue in that space of the breath, noticing it, feeling it out, letting it be a guide and a passenger in the completion of that initial framing in of a cake idea. And we can now move to looking at how it sits on something, always a little as you feel ready, some thing it sits upon, maybe a small like piece of paper with a nice edge, just to keep the plate clean and provide another layer or interface of contrast. Maybe it sits right on the plate, whatever you start to feel is right for your piece. Just giving it a little bit of an edge, using the structure we have set up to add one more visual layer, running roughly parallel to the sides. Building out from the object into its place of sitting, its setting on the page. Using that space made through the initial interaction, the pen, pencil, and the paper, the softness as a guide. Letting our imagination fold outwards, maybe some layers and edging, or maybe working out into the plate it sits upon. Letting that come into the imagination as the pencil moves. Is it round or square? Maybe on a board or tray. Something that could be simpler to draw if the roundness feels a little daunting. No need to be sitting on a round plate. I think it could be nice if this sat on a little piece of cutting board or wood, something with a rectangular shape. But working out farther into the space of the paper using some alignment to edges, keeping lines seaming perpendicular and parallel, framing out that object further into the space. And the pure plane, there's a certain relationship establishes place or ground, a sitting of something. Most things aren't just a plane, most have another thickness, another layering, just like the cake to have material, and just a dropping down of the edges, a little bit straight, to some degree of thickness. If it's a plate, maybe it's kind of thin. If it's a board or a table, a little thicker. Now framed out to give it a little bit of place, to hide some of those construction lines. An eraser can always fix those later in composition. And now we can then focus back inwards, the object set off from the background, from the page, beginning a setting of its own, and start to give some contrast or variation to the layers there. Choosing your starting place, perhaps a light shading to the icing, or a light dashing or marking to give texture to the cake, finding something fun for the hand to do. Maybe a wiggle, a move around, a dash, little dots, something that has a high action, high engagement of the mind and the eyes, location, pointing, a lot of moving and freedom to play that takes precision out, but adds focus to the placement of the instrument. And take a few minutes to begin adding some textures internally to get a little zone of lighter and darker, a layering, tone, and texture. It brings this off the page a little more. As we draw with something slower, the building up of this texture, spending time in each of those layers, a focused time in a small zone of space. Maybe notice things that look out of place, strange lines that are too heavy or lines that are missing. Noticing them, putting them on a shelf or a table in the mind, knowing you can always come back, adjust, bring in an eraser and lighten, bring a heavier pencil and darken. Layer by layer, the drawing can reach towards an imagined goal, representation. But now we're working just through one part, bringing a little texture, detail to something, bringing a little contrast to one aspect. The drawing, painting, or work of expression builds up over time, getting to know each aspect on its own, so that the mind can work to bring them together, so that the image can form more completely from the memory images of the first imagining to the real images of the medium on the paper. But in doing any creative act, playful, fun, abstract, or concrete, visions of what it might come, what it could be, may flash through the mind, whether that's thoughts of the real thing or ways the drawing could develop, become a creative work beyond the exercise. It's nice to let those drift through the picture, but for a little while, let them sink into the mind. They're interesting. They'll return. They'll come back. And maybe you'll come back yourself to the drawing, add more to it, refine it, expand it into something. One of the only paintings I've ever thought about purchasing to put up was a big piece of cherry pie, very well rendered. It just looked like the sensation or feeling of eating, cutting into something. It was too big, very far from where I live. But a small piece of cake, an apple, a lobster, all these things that are elements of still lifes and creative works, reflections of something from the everyday, carefully considered and composed to capture as much of their sensation and share that through an image, creative act, to create the virtual connection to something real. It's a long-standing part of painting, drawing, of art, and of human communication and imagination. So there starts with a little wedge of cake. It could expand layer by layer, interaction by interaction, for weeks, months, or years, into some perfect expression of your mind's vision of the subject, and a connection to others who see it, maybe share it in a similar way. But as we come close to the end of the exercise, finishing out a zone of texture, adding some little enhancements or embellishments to curves being pulled where the drawing encourages you next. Slowly choose a place of finishing for the time being. At the end of this run, bring the pencil to a close. At the end of these dots, I'll rest the pen on the paper. And know that anytime you can come back and continue to work, to add, to take away, to refine, to erase. to change. But now, we've brought out a form, an object we recognize into the world from a few minutes with a pencil on a piece of paper as a starting point for an idea. Well, what more is there to say? We all probably are in a place now of really feeling out and imagining that cake, desiring some of its sensations, the sweetness, the fluffiness, the silkiness of the icing, or maybe just the aesthetic experience of a well-made, well-crafted cake, or maybe it's the baking, the process of making it and sharing it with others. Whatever this object can begin to represent for you beyond its existence on the page, beyond the exactness of its expression, but into your own mindful inhabitation of that space, building out creativity and sharing in communication. Because that's what cake is for sharing, for celebrating, for enjoying our time with others, and coming together around something special. I hope the exercise entices and engages your imagination. Let me know in the comments below what type of cake you are interested in forming through your mindful act of drawing out there on the paper. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed the exercise, share with your friends, and subscribe for weekly episodes of Mindful Drawing, usually every Wednesday morning here on YouTube. I'm going to go finish putting together the cake for my partner, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Draw well. Enjoy.